Dawn came to Frederick, Colorado, the way it always did in summer. Light sliding across rooftops and driveways as if nothing in the world had changed. The street looked clean, quiet, arranged. The kind of neighborhood that makes you believe trouble belongs somewhere else. And yet, in one house, the morning had a missing weight. The question was not where someone had gone. The question was how a home could lose 3 people without leaving behind the sound of a door, the trace of a hurried goodbye, the ordinary mess that follows a family in motion. A car sat where it always sat. The garage kept its careful order. The front steps held the same still air. Everything looked intact, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. In real life, people do not vanish neatly. A phone remained behind, quiet and unlit, as if it had been set down with no intention of being picked up again. A handbag that should have traveled with its owner did not. Small shoes that belonged to small feet did not leave the house. A child's comfort item, the kind that moves from room to room like a shadow, stayed in place. When police arrived, the house did not greet them with chaos. It greeted them with a silence so complete it felt rehearsed. The sort of silence that makes an officer slow down, not because there is evidence in plain sight, but because the absence of evidence feels like a warning. Neighbors watched from windows and porches with the restrained concern of people who live close, but never too close. Their curiosity carried the same shape as their fear. If it could happen in that house, it could happen in any house. If a family could disappear without a struggle loud enough to spill into the street, then the street itself was not as safe as it looked. A man stepped forward to meet the questions. He was the one still present. Husband, father, the last known person to see them. He stood in the doorway and tried to arrange his face into the expression the moment required. But there is a difference between grief and performance, and the human mind senses it almost immediately, even when it cannot yet explain it. His eyes moved, but they did not seem to search. His body was there, but it did not seem to collapse under the weight of what he was describing. His voice did not carry the raw panic people expect when the world has just cracked open. The unease began there, at the threshold, in the space between what was happening and what should have been happening. Because this was not a story about strangers and shadows. This was a story about a man who looked like routine. A man with a steady job, an unremarkable manner, the kind of presence that blended into the background of family photographs. A man who had built an identity around being reliable, quiet, manageable. A man whose life, from the outside, appeared constructed from the same pieces as everyone else's. The world would come to know him as Christopher Watts. And that house, on a calm street under a bright Colorado sky, would become the center of a modern nightmare, one that forced millions of people to confront a truth they never wanted to hold in their hands. The most dangerous lies are often told in the language of normal life. To understand how the morning happened, it is necessary to understand the life that existed before it, the life that looked so public and so complete. Shannon Watts did not present herself as someone who lived in quiet corners. She was visible. She was expressive. She worked hard to build momentum, to build connection, to build a future she could name out loud. Her world was filled with plans, messages, schedules, announcements, the constant motion of a family held together by effort. Their daughters, Bella and Celeste, were at the age where personality is not hidden. They were small, bright, impulsive, the kind of children whose presence changes the temperature of a room. A house with 2 children like that rarely feels empty, even when the lights are off. And Shannon was pregnant again, carrying a 3rd child and the weight of what that meant. Another life. Another responsibility. Another future that could not be undone with a simple change of mood. From the outside, it looked like a family preparing for the next chapter. But families do not break in front of an audience. They fracture in private, through pressure that accumulates quietly, through resentments that are swallowed instead of spoken, through debts and disappointments and emotional withdrawals that do not show up in photographs. The Watts household held its own pressures, some practical and some invisible. Money worries, the constant strain of maintaining a certain standard of life. The exhaustion that comes from parenting, from work, from trying to stay afloat while still appearing grateful. Then came the distance. In the summer of 2018, Shannon and the children spent significant time away from Colorado. Travel for work, visits with family. Days that moved her and the girls out of the house, out of the daily pattern. Distance can bring relief to a strained marriage, but it can also create space for something else to grow. Chris Watts, left with the emptiness of his own routine, did not simply wait for his family to return. Something shifted inside him, and it did not shift toward repair. He began to change his habits. He focused on his body, on control, on discipline, on reshaping himself into someone he believed could start over. He began to live with a new kind of secrecy, the kind that does not always announce itself with obvious signs, but shows up as a subtle tightening of privacy, a guardedness around his phone, a new distance in his attention. And then there was another woman. An affair is often described as a betrayal of a spouse, but in cases like this, it becomes something larger. It becomes a betrayal of the life a person has already built, a betrayal of the children who still believe the world is stable, a betrayal of reality itself. Because an affair does not just add a secret, it creates a competing future. It offers a version of life without the obligations that have become heavy. A version without a mortgage that feels like a trap, without arguments that feel endless, without the daily demands of children who need more than a tired parent can give. It is not only desire. It is escape. And escape, when it becomes the central craving, changes the way a person looks at everything that stands in the way. When Shannon sensed the shift, she did not ignore it. She felt the coldness in the messages, the difference in his tone, the lack of warmth that had once been natural. She tried to pull him back toward her with questions, with concern, with the urgency of someone who understands that marriage is not a thing you possess, but a thing you actively maintain. But there is a particular kind of despair that grows when one person is fighting for a relationship and the other person has already begun to imagine their life without it. Chris did not have the temperament of a man who liked conflict. He did not move through life with dramatic confrontation. Instead, he contained things. He swallowed them. He tried to keep the surface calm while something underneath him hardened. That kind of containment can look like patience. But sometimes it is not patience at all. Sometimes it is avoidance, pushed to a point where the mind begins to search for a solution that does not require honesty. In the days leading up to the disappearance, Shannon returned to Colorado late from a work trip. She had been gone, traveling, exhausted, still trying to keep the forward motion of her life intact. She came back to the house expecting, at minimum, the basic certainty of home. But the atmosphere inside the marriage had changed. The home did not feel like shelter anymore. It felt like a place where questions hung in the air unanswered. Chris was there, the father in the house, the husband in the bed, the man who should have been part of the future she was carrying. Yet a future can be present in someone's body and absent in their mind. The hours that followed her return were not hours the world could see. They were domestic, private, trapped behind walls. And this is where so many true crime stories become unbearable, because they force us to confront the fact that the most catastrophic moments are often wrapped in ordinary surroundings. A kitchen, a hallway, a bedroom, a staircase that children run down every day without fear. By morning, Shannon and the girls were gone, and Chris Watts was still there. He did what people often do when they sense the world turning toward them. He began to shape the narrative. He contacted others. He presented concern. He described his wife and children as missing, as if the word itself could create distance between him and what had happened. But as the hours passed, that word grew heavier. Missing. It can mean so many things at first. A misunderstanding, a spontaneous decision, a phone left on silent, a friend who offered a ride, a medical emergency, a stranger passing through. Yet when children are missing, the air changes. The assumption of safety disappears. The community's imagination turns dark because it has to. It is not pessimism. It is survival. Officers moved through the house and saw the same troubling stillness. Nothing broken. Nothing overturned. No loud evidence of struggle. And still, the feeling remained that something irreversible had occurred. Outside, a neighbor's surveillance footage became part of the story almost immediately, not because it showed violence, but because it showed movement. A vehicle, a man in the early light, the quiet mechanics of routine, the kind of scene that should have meant nothing at all and yet suddenly meant everything. The investigation tightened, as it always does when the last known person becomes the first unavoidable question. Chris was the anchor point, the husband, the father, the one who could not explain the silence in a way that sounded true. He tried. But truth has a weight and a rhythm to it. Even when the facts are incomplete, truth tends to move with a certain inevitability, a certain coherence. A lie, especially a lie told under pressure, carries a different rhythm. It stumbles. It over-explains. It leaves gaps it cannot fill. It changes shape depending on who is listening. As the day stretched forward, the neighborhood that had started the morning in sunlight began to feel like a place under a shadow. People gathered. Friends called. Shannon's closest friend pressed for answers with the urgency of someone who knew her patterns, who knew she would not simply disappear without contact, not with her children, not with her pregnancy, not with a life she documented and managed so carefully. The missing persons case did not feel like a mystery that would unfold slowly. It felt like an emergency that had already passed its point of no return. And inside the man at the center of it, something was beginning to fail. Because the hardest part of building a false version of reality is maintaining it in front of people who are paying attention. The police attention did not drift away. It narrowed. Chris Watts agreed to cooperate, agreed to talk, agreed to submit to the kinds of procedures that most innocent people accept without fear, believing transparency will bring help. He spoke about his family as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that they were simply out there somewhere, still alive, still retrievable. But the case was already moving into a darker logic. Investigators do not begin with the assumption that a husband is a monster. They begin with the assumption that people are complicated, that families can hide fractures, and that the most likely answers are often the closest ones. They looked at timelines. They examined the last known movements. They considered whether Shannon could have left on her own, whether she had resources, whether she had plans, whether she had shown signs of wanting to vanish. The answers came back the same way, again and again. No. And when the easy explanations fail, the mind is forced toward the unbearable ones. The marriage had been strained. That much became clear. Not only through what Chris suggested, but through the emotional residue Shannon had left in messages and conversations, through the way she had reached out to friends, through the anxious energy that had surrounded her in the weeks before the disappearance. She had not been living a life that was quietly drifting. She had been living a life that was actively trying to stay together, which meant that if she was gone, it was not because she had chosen to erase herself. It was because someone else had erased her. The pressure built rapidly. Media arrived, not as a distant presence, but as a hungry machine, turning the street into a backdrop, turning the house into an image people would recognize. Cameras captured Chris outside, speaking with a controlled urgency that never fully sounded like panic. And viewers, even in those earliest hours, began to sense what investigators were beginning to consider. This did not look right. His demeanor did not match the catastrophe he claimed to be living through. There was a tightness to him, a restraint that suggested not grief, but containment, as if he were trying to keep something from spilling out. And then, as often happens in modern cases, the truth began to approach from the side angle people rarely expect, through the quiet exposure of a private life. The affair emerged as a fact, a hidden relationship, newly important, newly consuming. The kind of revelation that reframes everything. The kind of revelation that tells investigators the marriage was not merely strained, but destabilized. That the man at the center had a reason to want a different life. Not everyone who wants a different life commits a crime. But in a case where a wife and 2 children are missing, a reason becomes a lever, and a lever becomes pressure. Chris Watts was pressed harder. His story was tested. His calm was examined. The distance between his words and the reality of what was happening became impossible to ignore. And somewhere in that tightening circle, the life he had tried to keep separate began to collapse into one point. The question was no longer whether he knew more than he was saying. The question was what he had done to ensure the silence inside that house. Because there is only one way a home can lose 3 people without leaving behind the sound of a departure. Someone inside the home made sure they could not leave. And the man still standing in the doorway was not merely a witness to the disappearance. He was the only remaining piece that could explain it. The next phase of the case moved quickly, not because investigators wanted it to, but because the circumstances demanded it. Missing children do not allow for patience. A pregnant woman does not allow for delay. Every hour that passes without answers becomes its own kind of violence. Chris was brought in for further questioning. He sat in controlled rooms under controlled lights, facing the reality that his performance on the front lawn was no longer enough. His words had to align with evidence. His timelines had to hold. But evidence has a way of turning the air in a room colder. A detail here, a contradiction there. A statement that shifts slightly with repetition. A claim that cannot be supported by the most basic facts. Investigators applied methods designed not to create panic, but to reveal truth. They watched for emotional consistency. They watched for signs of genuine fear. They watched for the subtle markers of deception, not as theatrical tells, but as fractures in the mind's ability to maintain an invented story. Chris tried to hold his shape. Yet the weight of what he had done, and the pressure of being seen, began to crush the structure from within. Because the human body can only pretend for so long, the voice tightens. The eyes lose their practiced steadiness. The rhythm of speech falters. The mind begins to search for exits that no longer exist. And this is where the story turns from a missing persons case into something far darker, because the investigation did not simply uncover marital tension. It uncovered a man who was attempting to step out of his own life as if it were a coat he could leave behind. He wanted the freedom of a new relationship without the wreckage of a public separation. He wanted the simplicity of starting over without the consequences of ending what already existed. He wanted, in the most disturbing sense, a clean slate. But there are no clean slates in real life. There are only choices and aftermaths. And the aftermath was already spreading through that neighborhood like smoke, settling into the minds of parents watching their own children play, settling into the thoughts of husbands and wives glancing at each other across kitchen counters, settling into the quiet fear that the people closest to you are not always the people you know. The missing became a hunt. The hunt became a narrowing. And soon, the story would reach the moment where the truth was no longer something Chris Watts could keep hidden behind a controlled expression. Because the world was not only watching. The world was closing in. And the world was closing in. It closed in with the quiet precision of process, with schedules and paperwork and controlled rooms, with the steady pressure that does not need to raise its voice because it has time, training, and the certainty that facts do not bend forever. It closed in with the weight of Shannon's absence, with the brutal logic of 2 small children who had not been seen, not heard, not accounted for, and with a pregnancy that made every hour feel like an irreversible theft. For Chris Watts, The first day demanded performance in public. The second demanded endurance in private. Investigators did not need him to appear guilty. They needed him to speak until his story revealed its own cracks. They needed his timelines, his emotions, his small choices of language. They needed him to keep talking while the world around him gathered evidence in silence. Because evidence does not argue, it accumulates. It begins with the ordinary, the kind of details that feel too small to matter until they form a shape. A time stamp, a neighbor's camera, a phone's last movements, the pattern of a morning routine interrupted, the difference between a person leaving a house and a person being removed from it, the neighbor's surveillance footage, so unremarkable in any other context, carried the eerie power of routine. The camera did not capture violence. It captured a man moving with purpose in the early light, backing his truck into a position that was not typical, making repeated trips between the house and the vehicle. To anyone watching, the mind did what it always does when confronted with uncertainty. It tried to give the actions an innocent explanation. Tools for work, a forgotten item, an unusual errand. But innocence is not something investigators assign out of comfort. Innocence is something that must remain plausible after scrutiny, and scrutiny had begun. Chris told people he had no idea where his family was. He spoke of arguments, of emotional distance, of a wife who might have left in anger. He offered the possibility that she had taken the children elsewhere. He attempted, as so many do in the earliest moments of exposure, to create space between himself and the worst conclusion. Yet those closest to Shannon could not accept the version of her that story required. Shannon was not a woman who disappeared without a plan. She was not a woman who left her phone behind as if her identity no longer mattered. She was not a woman who abandoned routine without signaling it. Her life, for better or worse, had been built on connection and communication. And her friend, the one who sounded the alarm, understood something before the authorities could fully articulate it. This was not a delayed response to a missed message. This was an emergency. The friend had arrived at the house with a mother's intuition sharpened by familiarity. She noticed what did not fit: the silence, the car seat still present, the medication left behind, the way the house felt wrong even from the outside. She insisted on contact. She pushed. She called police early, refusing to let the day slide into the false comfort of waiting. That insistence mattered. In many cases, the early hours become a fog where possibilities still seem open. In this case, the fog was torn apart almost immediately, replaced by a harsh, investigative clarity. When officers entered the house, they noted the small signs of interruption. When they looked at the environment, they did not see the scattered mess of a family fleeing or the hurried chaos of a spontaneous departure. They saw stillness. They saw traces of life paused rather than moved. And the man at the center of it all was always there, hovering close, speaking in a controlled way that did not match the rising panic around him. Control can be an admirable trait. In this context, it began to feel like something else. As the case moved forward, the private fractures in the Watts marriage became impossible to hide. The distance between husband and wife was not a rumor. It was documented in the texture of their recent communication, in the anxiety Shannon had confided to friends, in the pattern of emotional withdrawal that had grown more obvious with time. Chris had begun to act like a man preparing for a life he had not admitted he wanted. He had been losing weight, changing his body with discipline, as if reinventing himself. He had become increasingly detached, increasingly cold. And then there was the relationship outside the marriage, the secret that transformed his domestic life into something he saw as an obstacle rather than a commitment. The existence of that relationship did not prove murder, but it proved motive for rupture. And it proved that Chris had been living a double life, at least emotionally, long before anyone outside the marriage had realized. In cases involving missing spouses and children, investigators often look for the point where pressure becomes action. They look for moments of escalation, the emotional tipping points that turn fantasy into something physical. They examine finances, relationships, recent purchases, changes in routine. They build a psychological map, not to create a villain in advance, but to understand what kind of person would choose what kind of outcome. For Chris Watts, the map was tightening into a bleak shape. He had a wife who was pregnant and expecting answers. He had children whose needs were constant and unavoidable. He had financial strain that made the idea of separation complicated. He had an affair that offered him a glimpse of a simpler, less burdened future. And he had a temperament that avoided confrontation, that swallowed resentment, that treated conflict like something to be escaped rather than resolved. That combination can create a specific danger, not the danger of rage that erupts openly. The danger of a person who wants an outcome but cannot tolerate the process required to reach it honestly. The investigation moved him into the next inevitable step, a formal interview, then a polygraph examination. These are moments that people misunderstand. They imagine the polygraph as a machine that detects lies like an alarm. In reality, it is a tool used alongside observation, a way to measure stress responses, to apply structured pressure, to see whether a person's physiology aligns with their claims. Chris agreed to it. He presented himself as cooperative, as willing to do what was needed to find his family. But cooperation can be another kind of performance, and sometimes the willingness to participate is not a sign of innocence, but a sign of desperation to appear innocent. Inside the controlled environment of questioning, the careful mask began to slip. The more he spoke, the more he was forced to inhabit a story that did not fit the evidence. The more he tried to keep his words smooth, the more his body betrayed strain. The measured calm began to crack at the edges. Investigators watched, listened, and applied pressure with restraint. They did not need theatrics. They needed him to reach the point where the lie could no longer hold its own weight. That point arrived the way it often does, not as a dramatic explosion, but as a collapse. It began with denial that softened into partial admission. It moved into a confession shaped to minimize the worst parts. A narrative offered not as truth, but as bargaining, as a desperate attempt to control how the world would see him once control was already gone. He first tried to place the central act of violence on Shannon. He suggested a scenario in which she had harmed the children, and he had responded in a state of shock and rage. It was an ancient instinct of the guilty to redirect the horror toward the person who can no longer defend herself. But the story carried the same problem his earlier explanations carried. It did not fit. It did not match the known patterns of Shannon's attachment to her children. It did not align with what her friends understood about her. And it did not resolve the deeper contradiction of the mourning, the absence of a chaotic departure, the strange calmness, the suspicious movements at the house. The partial confession was not an ending. It was an opening. Because once a person admits to any part of the unthinkable, the investigators no longer have to persuade reality to enter the room. Reality is already there. The only question becomes how much of it the person will finally surrender. Chris Watts was arrested, and the story moved into its most devastating phase, the search not for missing people, but for remains. It is difficult to describe what that shift does to everyone involved. To the investigators, it becomes a grim duty: locate, document, recover, preserve dignity where dignity has been stolen. To the community, it becomes confirmation of their worst fear. To the family, it becomes a kind of spiritual rupture, the moment where hope is not simply reduced, but destroyed. The search led to Chris's workplace, to oil and gas sites spread across the landscape, industrial spaces where the earth feels both vast and indifferent. These were not places associated with family life, not places where children should exist, not places where a pregnant woman should ever be found. The very location itself carried a symbolic cruelty, domestic love transported into an environment of machinery and emptiness. When the truth of what had happened emerged fully, it did not arrive as a single clean statement. It arrived through the convergence of admission and discovery, the way all dark cases eventually do. The facts, once revealed, were irreversible. Shannon and the children were not missing. They had been taken from the world by the man who had promised to keep them safe. The details, when spoken aloud, carried a weight almost too large for language. It became clear that the crime was not a sudden, impulsive act committed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. It was the end point of a private unraveling, a choice made under the cold logic of someone who wanted a new life and saw his existing one as an obstacle rather than a responsibility. In the days that followed, the public watched the case transform from confusion to horror with a speed that felt unreal. The images of Shannon's face and the faces of Bella and Celeste moved across screens, not as distant victims, but as a family people felt they had already seen in ordinary life. The horror was amplified by familiarity. This did not look like a story about strangers. It looked like a story about neighbors. And then the affair, the private relationship that had been one of the driving pressures beneath the surface, became part of the wider narrative. The other woman did not appear as a mastermind, but as a catalyst, a figure around whom Chris had built his fantasy of escape. Investigators examined their communications, their timelines, their language. They looked for signs of knowledge, signs of involvement, signs of anything that could explain how far Chris had gone and whether anyone else had helped him do it. The public's hunger for answers turned that aspect of the story into its own storm. In cases like this, people search for additional villains because the central reality is too unbearable. The husband alone was enough. The father alone was enough. If someone else had pushed him, persuaded him, guided him, then perhaps the universe would feel less chaotic. But chaos does not require multiple actors. Sometimes it only requires one person's moral collapse. The legal process moved forward, as it had to. Chris faced charges that reflected the enormity of what he had done. The community watched. The families of the victims lived inside a nightmare that would not end, and the broader public tried to reconcile the images of a seemingly ordinary man with the reality of his actions. The most disturbing aspect remained unchanged. Not that he had been a stranger who drifted into violence, but that he had been a husband who ate dinner in that house, a father who held those children, a man who had lived inside the trust that makes family possible. When the case reached its conclusion in court, it did not bring relief. It brought finality, and finality is not the same as peace. The facts were acknowledged. The guilt was formalized. The prison sentence created a cage for the perpetrator, but no cage can restore what was removed. And even after conviction, even after the world declared the case closed, the questions lingered in a quieter way, the questions that never fully leave tragedies like this. What happens inside a person when they decide their own desires matter more than human life? How a mind can turn children into obstacles. How a man can stand on a driveway under a bright sky and speak of missing loved ones while knowing the truth is already buried in the ground and sealed behind steel. The Watts case became more than a case. It became a cultural wound. People studied it not because it offered mystery, but because it offered a terrifying clarity about the nature of deception. It showed how someone can wear the shape of normal life so convincingly that those closest never see the darkness forming beneath. In the end, the most haunting image is not the courtroom, not the police presence, not the news cameras. It is the early morning stillness of a suburban street, a house that looks like every other house, a driveway that holds a vehicle, a door that opens, and a man who steps forward, trying to speak his way out of the truth, while the truth waits behind him, silent, absolute, and already beyond anyone's ability to undo. And that truth, once exposed, did not simply end the story. It changed its shape. Because when the immediate crisis is over, when the searches stop, and the headlines harden into familiar wording, what remains is the long aftermath, the part that does not fit neatly into a broadcast segment. The part that unfolds in quiet rooms and private grief, in court documents and prison corridors, in the slow, relentless work of families trying to live in a world that has been permanently altered. In the weeks after the disappearance, Frederick did not return to normal. The street remained the same street, the mailboxes remained in place, the lawns continued to be cut, but the feeling of safety had been punctured. People drove past the house with the same instinct people have when tragedy becomes a landmark, a pull that is half curiosity and half warning. They imagined their own kitchens, their own bedrooms, their own children asleep at night, and they tried to locate the boundary between their lives and that life. The boundary was not where they wanted it to be. For Shannon's family, the boundary was gone entirely. The grief was not abstract, not something to be processed slowly with distance. It arrived as a violent, immediate reality, and it brought with it a secondary pain that is unique to these cases. The knowledge that the person who took everything away was not a faceless intruder, but a man who sat at their table, smiled in photographs, held their grandchildren. There is no language that fully describes that kind of betrayal. It is not only loss, it is a collapse of meaning, a destruction of trust so complete that it spreads outward, touching every memory and turning ordinary moments into sharp-edged questions. How long had he been like this? Was any part of him real? Were there moments of genuine love or only moments of convenience? Did the children ever sense danger in the arms they trusted most? Those questions do not lead to answers that heal. They lead to an endless corridor of mental images and regrets, to the unbearable human habit of replaying the past in search of a moment that could have changed the outcome. But the past does not change. The legal system moved with its own cold momentum. Charges were filed that reflected the scale of what had happened, and the case advanced toward resolution. In the public imagination, resolution often sounds like a final chapter, as if guilt and sentencing can close the door. In reality, legal resolution is only the point where society formally recognizes the truth and imposes consequences. It does not restore the victims. It does not repair the families. It does not unteach the world what it has just learned. Chris Watts eventually entered a guilty plea, and that decision carried its own disturbing implications. A trial would have exposed details more publicly, would have forced a full confrontation with evidence, would have required him to sit in open court while the story was reconstructed piece by piece. A plea removed that spectacle, but it did not remove the pain. It brought the case to a conclusion without the prolonged drama, yet the conclusion was still heavy, still irreversible. On the day of sentencing, the air in the courtroom was the kind of air that feels too thick to breathe. Courtrooms are designed to look neutral, to look like places where emotion is irrelevant. But in cases like this, neutrality fails. The room becomes a vessel for grief, and every small movement, every shuffle of paper, every step across the floor feels amplified. Family members arrived carrying the weight of what they were about to do. Speak the unspeakable, not as performance, not as public statement, but as a final attempt to honor lives that had been taken and to confront the man responsible with the consequences of being seen. Victim impact statements in a case like this are not simply speeches. They are acts of survival. They are the moment where people who have been stripped of control over the most important thing in their world reclaim a sliver of agency by naming what was done to them. Shannon's loved ones spoke of the woman they knew, the mother who was present and determined, the daughter whose absence was not a concept but a wound that had no bottom. They spoke of Bella and Celeste, of their laughter, their needs, their innocence. They spoke of the future that had been erased, including the child Shannon had been carrying, a future that had existed not as a theory but as a heartbeat. They described the damage not only in terms of death, but in terms of what death does to those left behind. The way it enters daily life, the way it changes mornings, the way it turns holidays into endurance tests, the way it transforms the simplest acts like hearing a child's name or seeing a toy into sudden collapse. And there was an additional layer, an almost unbearable moral complexity. Some of them still had to look at the man responsible and recognize that he was tied to them forever, not only as a murderer, but as the father of the children they would mourn for the rest of their lives. Even the law cannot sever that connection completely. It can punish him, it can remove him, but it cannot rewrite the fact that his bloodline intersects with theirs. That is one of the cruelest aspects of familial homicide. It creates a permanent, contaminated bond between victim and perpetrator families, a bond built not on love, but on shared devastation. Chris sat through these proceedings with the same restrained demeanor the world had seen earlier, but by then, his composure no longer had the power it once did. The mask that had seemed unsettling in a driveway now seemed smaller, trapped inside the reality of what he had done. A courtroom does not allow the same kind of improvisation as a television interview. In court, a person is reduced to facts, charges, and consequence. The sentence imposed reflected the severity of the crimes, and yet no sentence can feel proportional in a case where children have been taken by the person meant to protect them. The punishment is a societal statement, a declaration that such acts place someone outside the moral boundaries of community. But the statement does not satisfy grief. It does not answer the deeper human questions about how such a thing becomes possible. After sentencing, Chris Watts entered prison life, and the story moved from public spectacle to closed confinement. But confinement does not erase fascination. If anything, it can intensify it. People continue to search for meaning in cases like this because they are not merely interested in crime. They are frightened by the implications. If a man can live a seemingly ordinary life and then annihilate it from within, what does that say about the predictability of the people around us? What does that say about marriage, about trust, about the private worlds that exist behind closed doors? What does that say about how little we truly know, even when we think we know everything? In the months that followed, the case continued to evolve through information released, interviews conducted, and the slow leakage of details that the public consumed with a mixture of horror and fixation. Investigators, long after the formal conclusion, still had reasons to speak with him. Not out of sympathy, but out of necessity. In crimes of this nature, understanding matters, not because it can undo the outcome, but because it can inform future prevention, future detection, future recognition of patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. When Chris later provided additional accounts of what happened, the narrative shifted in ways that made the case even more disturbing. It became clear that his initial partial confession had been shaped to deflect blame and preserve some fragment of self-image. Over time, the story he told began to align more closely with what evidence and logic demanded, yet the alignment did not feel like moral clarity. It felt like a further unraveling of a person who had built his identity on appearing manageable. Even then, his explanations carried the emptiness common to perpetrators who cannot fully articulate their own collapse. He could describe steps and events, but the reason underneath them remained both simple and terrifying. He wanted a different life, and he chose to obtain it through annihilation rather than honesty. That is the moral core of the case, and it is why it remains so haunting. Not because it involves elaborate criminal genius, not because it unfolds like a clever mystery, but because it reveals how mundane motives can lead to catastrophic choices when a person's internal boundaries dissolve. Desire, resentment, escape, a craving to remove obstacles rather than face consequences. It is a list that could belong to many ordinary lives, and that is what makes it so frightening. The difference is not that Chris Watts experienced these feelings, but that he allowed them to override the most basic moral laws that keep society intact. As the public continued to consume the case, another theme emerged with clarity: the role of visibility. Shannon had documented much of her life publicly, and that documentation became both a gift and a curse. It preserved memories. It gave the world a sense of who she was. It made the victims feel real to strangers who might otherwise have scrolled past. But it also created an illusion of complete knowledge, an illusion that the audience could see the marriage, see the dynamics, see the warning signs. People dissected videos and photographs, interpreting expressions, body language, tone. They searched for clues that might explain everything, as if the crime could be prevented retroactively through analysis. That instinct is understandable. It is the mind's way of trying to regain control. If we can identify the signs, then we can believe we are safe. If we can label the behaviors, then we can believe we would never miss them. Yet the hard truth is that many signs are only clear after the fact. Many marriages contain tension. Many people withdraw emotionally. Many couples struggle with money, with stress, with exhaustion. The difference between a failing marriage and a lethal one is not always visible to outsiders. And that is why this case became a kind of cultural nightmare. It did not offer the comfort of obvious evil. It offered the terror of hidden erosion. In Frederick, in the months and years afterward, people carried the story in the way communities carry trauma, quietly, in glances, in conversations that stop abruptly, in a heightened awareness of what lies beneath normal appearances. The house itself, once just a piece of real estate, became a symbol, a place people projected fear onto, a structure that held the memory of a family and the echo of something unspeakable. Meanwhile, Shannon's family had to endure the public life of their private pain. They could not mourn in quiet isolation because the case had become famous. Every new release of information, every documentary segment, every public discussion reopened the wound. Strangers debated the details of their daughter's life and death as if it were entertainment, as if the most intimate tragedy imaginable could be processed like a story. There is a particular cruelty in that. The victims are frozen in public memory, their faces endlessly replayed, while their loved ones must keep living in the real world where those faces are missing from kitchens, from holiday tables, from the daily rhythm of family life. And then there were the children, Bella and Celeste, whose absence carried a special kind of grief. Adult death is tragic, but childhood death is a violation of the order people rely on to make life bearable. Children represent continuity, innocence, the future. When they are taken, especially by a parent, the crime feels like a rupture in the natural law of care. People struggled not only to understand what happened, but to hold it in their minds without collapsing. They asked how a father could do it, as if fatherhood itself should be a shield against violence. They asked what the children experienced, as if imagining their fear could somehow honor them, even though imagining it caused pain. The case forced society to confront a reality that has always existed, but is often hidden. The home can be the most dangerous place, not because strangers enter it, but because the person inside it can change. In prison, Chris Watts became a paradox of his own making. Removed from society, he could no longer perform normal life, yet he was still consumed by the same thing that had driven him before: control over narrative. Even behind bars, the urge to shape how people perceived him did not disappear. The human ego does not dissolve simply because freedom is gone. But control is always limited by truth, and truth in this case had a permanence that no storytelling could soften. The world knew what he had done. His name was now fused to the worst kind of betrayal. His future was not a future of redemption, but a future of confinement, of waking up each day inside consequences that could not be negotiated. And still, the most important story was never his. It was Shannon's and Bella's and Celeste's, and the child who never reached the world. It was the story of lives that had been ordinary and real, filled with the small moments that rarely make headlines: bedtime routines, family meals, plans for the coming months, the quiet work of building stability. Their lives were not defined by their deaths, even if the world struggles to remember that. They were defined by the love they gave, the hopes they carried, the future they believed existed. And the final cruelty of the case is that their future was not taken by chance. It was taken by a choice made inside the very place that should have been safest. In the years that followed, the public continued to ask for deeper explanations, for psychological profiles, for warnings, for patterns that could be extracted from the tragedy and turned into guidance. Some people looked at Chris Watts and saw a man who had been quietly resentful, emotionally detached, incapable of conflict resolution. Others saw a man who had become intoxicated by a new relationship and the fantasy it offered. Others focused on finances, on stress, on the pressure of another child, on the weight of maintaining a public image. All of these factors can be discussed, analyzed, placed into frameworks. But frameworks do not fully explain the moment of choice. At the center of this case remains a simple, unbearable truth. At some point, he decided the people who loved him were disposable. That is not a mistake. It is not a misunderstanding. It is not an accident. It is an act of moral annihilation. And for everyone left behind, the question becomes not only how to understand it, but how to continue living in a world where such a decision can be made. How to wake up and make coffee when the mind keeps returning to the image of a quiet suburban street. How to see a family photo and feel both love and rage. How to listen to silence and not hear absence. How to rebuild trust when trust has been shattered so publicly and so completely. There is no single answer. There is only the slow work of survival, the daily effort to carry grief without letting it erase everything else. It is the work Shannon's family and friends have had to do, the work that does not make headlines, the work that unfolds in private rooms, in anniversaries, in the long nights where memory becomes too vivid to escape. And in that sense, the story does not end with a sentence. It continues quietly in the lives of those who remain, who must hold on to love while living with the knowledge that love alone did not protect them. The house in Frederick can be sold. The street can look normal again. The news can move on. But there will always be a shadow that belongs to that summer morning, a shadow shaped like a missing family, a shadow that reminds the world that the most terrifying tragedies do not always arrive with warning signs visible from the outside. Sometimes they arrive wearing the face of normal life, walking through a quiet home, making a decision in silence, and leaving behind a stillness so complete it feels like the air itself has been told to hold its breath. And once a stillness like that enters public memory, it never fully leaves. It becomes a reference point people return to in quieter moments, when they are alone with their own lives and their own assumptions. It becomes a story told in the language of warning, even when no one can agree on what the warning signs were supposed to look like. It becomes the kind of case that reshapes the way an entire culture talks about marriage, about parenting, about the difference between the life people display and the life they actually inhabit. In the days immediately after the arrests and recoveries, investigators did what they always do in the wake of something irreversible. They rebuilt the sequence with painstaking attention, because justice requires clarity, and because clarity in cases like this is a form of respect for the dead. They mapped minutes. They verified routes. They tracked phone activity and location data. They examined surveillance footage, not for drama, but for the quiet confirmations that separate a narrative from a lie. The timeline was not merely a list of times and places. It was a portrait of an ordinary morning turned into an execution of intent. A man waking in a familiar house, moving through familiar rooms, inhabiting the same environment he had always inhabited, and yet using that environment as a stage for something so incompatible with family life that the mind resists holding it all at once. In the public imagination, the moment of violence is often treated as the central event. In reality, The central event in a case like this is the decision. The decision is what changes everything, because once it is made, everything that follows becomes logistics. The family home becomes not a sanctuary but a site. The truck becomes not a work vehicle but a tool. The routine becomes not comfort but cover. That is why people remember the neighbor's footage, why they remember the driveway and the early light. It is not because the footage shows horror. It is because the footage shows the banality surrounding horror. The way terrible choices can be carried out under a normal sky, while other people are still sleeping, while other houses on the street are still wrapped in the illusion that the day will be like any other. The case also revealed, in a way that unsettled even experienced investigators, how much of modern life is documented without anyone intending it to be evidence. Doorbell cameras, neighboring surveillance systems, cell phone towers, the internal logs of apps and devices. A person can attempt deception, can attempt to control a story, and still find that the world has recorded the truth in small fragments. Those fragments do not feel like much until they are assembled, until they form a picture too coherent to dismiss. At the center of that picture was a man who tried to project stability while his private life had been splitting in two. One half was the family world, heavy with obligations and expectations, a world where he was responsible, where he was needed, where his identity was tied to being a husband and father, even if he no longer wanted to be. The other half was the fantasy world, made vivid by a new relationship, a world where he felt unburdened, admired, newly alive, as if he had been granted permission to rewrite himself. The human mind is capable of holding contradictions for surprisingly long periods of time. People live with dissatisfaction. They live with secret resentment. They live with private longings that do not match the lives they have built. Most people endure that tension without destroying anyone because the moral boundary remains intact. The boundary says that discomfort is not a justification for harm. What the Watts case exposed is what happens when that boundary dissolves, when a person begins to treat other human beings not as lives with their own rights and futures, but as obstacles standing between him and the version of life he wants. That shift is often invisible from the outside. It happens internally, quietly, in small rationalizations that accumulate over time. A person tells himself he is trapped. He tells himself he deserves better. He tells himself the people around him will eventually be fine. He tells himself the consequences will be manageable, or that he will find a way around them. And then, at some point, the rationalizations stop being abstract. They become intent. For Shannon, the weeks leading up to her death were filled with the strain of sensing that her marriage was slipping out of her hands. She had lived in the effort of building a family life, and that effort had been public, documented, shared. But in private, she had been confronted with coldness she could not explain away. She reached out to friends. She tried to interpret the changes. She attempted to pull him into conversation, to draw out the truth, to salvage what she believed could be repaired. There is a specific kind of heartbreak in that, the heartbreak of someone who is still committed to the idea of repair, while the other person has moved into the idea of escape. The committed spouse becomes a person fighting an invisible opponent, because the opponent is not a third party or a single argument. The opponent is the other person's internal departure. When she returned to Colorado late that night, she returned with all of that tension inside her and with the vulnerability of exhaustion. She returned pregnant, carrying a child that represented a future she still believed could be real. She returned expecting, at minimum, the stability of physical presence, the sense that even if the marriage was strained, the family was still intact. In cases like this, the cruelty is not only in the outcome, it is in the betrayal of that expectation. After the disappearance, Shannon's friend did not allow the day to drift. That insistence is one of the reasons the investigation tightened quickly. It narrowed the window in which Chris could shape a broader story or buy time. It forced immediate scrutiny. It forced the house to be treated not as a temporary absence, but as a potential crime scene. It is an unsettling reality that in many tragedies, the speed of recognition changes what evidence survives. The earlier the intervention, the more traces remain. In this case, the intervention did not save lives, but it did something else. It forced the truth to surface faster, and it limited the space for an extended disappearance narrative to settle into the public's mind. When Chris was interviewed, when he agreed to procedures meant to test his story, he was stepping into a space where performance becomes harder to maintain. He had been able to speak on a lawn in daylight, surrounded by neighbors and cameras, with the open air giving him room to move. In interview rooms, there is no open air. There is only the pressure of direct attention and the slow tightening of questions. People often imagine that a guilty person breaks because of a sudden emotional confession. More often, they break because the story becomes too complicated to carry. They have to remember which version they told to whom. They have to anticipate evidence they do not control. They have to maintain emotional alignment with events that should be devastating while knowing they are the cause. That misalignment is exhausting. It eats at the mind. It produces mistakes. And when mistakes appear, investigators do not need to accuse. They only need to keep the person talking. The collapse that followed did not bring relief. It brought confirmation of the most unbearable possibility. It forced everyone involved to stop asking where Shannon and the children were and start accepting what had happened to them. It turned hope into a kind of grief that arrives suddenly, like the floor dropping away. The discovery of the victims at Chris's work site carried its own symbolic horror, because it made clear that the crime had been not only domestic, but planned around the spaces of his everyday life. The oil tanks, the industrial environment, the distance from the home, all of it suggested a person thinking in terms of concealment and disposal, not in terms of panic or accident. It is important in a case like this not to dwell on the physical details. The details can become a kind of voyeurism, and voyeurism is not understanding. The understanding lies elsewhere, in the emotional consequences and the moral collapse that made such details possible. The legal process that followed was, in some ways, mercifully swift. A trial could have stretched the case into months of public re-exposure. A plea brought formal responsibility without forcing the families through an extended public reconstruction. But even that mercy was limited. The families still had to sit in a room and speak through the unthinkable. They still had to watch the man responsible exist in the same space as the memory of the people he took. Sentencing did not feel like closure. It felt like the end of one chapter of suffering and the beginning of another, quieter one. Afterward, the public sought more. People always do. They looked for the why, as if why could soften the horror into something explainable, something that fits into categories the mind can tolerate. The more information surfaced, the more the case became a mirror for larger anxieties. The fear of being deceived by someone familiar. The fear of building a life with someone who might be privately unraveling. The fear that intimacy does not guarantee safety. This case also revealed something else about modern tragedy, how quickly private life becomes content. Videos of Shannon and the children circulated endlessly. Clips of Chris speaking to cameras became artifacts for analysis. Ordinary family moments became evidence in the court of public opinion. People paused frames, interpreted expressions, built theories about dynamics that can never be fully known from the outside. For Shannon's loved ones, that public consumption was another layer of trauma. Every repeated clip was a reminder. Every commentary was a stranger holding their grief in casual hands. And yet, even amid that consumption, something else happened. People began to speak more openly about coercive control, about emotional withdrawal, about the subtle ways a partner can begin to detach and dehumanize without leaving obvious marks. People began to look at the idea of the perfect family differently, not with cynicism, but with a more sober awareness that perfection displayed is not the same as stability lived. Still, awareness is not protection. The Watts case did not provide a simple checklist for safety. It did not offer a neat set of signs that, if recognized, could guarantee prevention. It offered a harsher lesson, that sometimes the danger lies in the person who seems least likely, and that the human capacity for secrecy can coexist with the most ordinary routines. Inside prison, Chris Watts would live the rest of his life in confinement, watched by systems built to contain men society cannot trust. But confinement does not transform a person into a comprehensible explanation. It only removes him from the world he harmed. The families he destroyed continued to carry the consequences without walls to hold them back. Time passed, as time always does, and the world moved on to other headlines, other tragedies, other stories. But the families did not move on. Moving on is a phrase people use when they want grief to behave politely. Real grief does not move on. It reshapes itself. It settles into the bones. It changes the way a person experiences every future event. For Shannon's parents, the future would always include the absence of their daughter. It would always include the knowledge that the grandchildren they loved were taken, not by an accident or a disease, but by deliberate choice. Their grief would not be a single period of mourning. It would be a lifetime of adjustments to a world that no longer contained the people they expected to grow old beside them. For friends and neighbors, the aftermath would be quieter but still real. They would remember the house. They would remember the initial confusion. They would remember the way their own assumptions about normal life were shattered. Some would become more cautious. Some would become more distrustful. Some would carry a persistent awareness that the calm surface of a family does not guarantee what lies beneath. And for the broader public, the case would remain a point of fixation because it touches a fear that is difficult to soothe. The fear that the person closest to you can become the person who harms you most, and that the harm can be carried out not in a moment of obvious rage, but in a cold pursuit of a different life. That fear lingers because it is not a fantasy. It is an edge of reality that society tries not to stare at for too long. Yet the most important moral weight of the story remains where it has always belonged, with the victims and the lives they lived before they became a case. Shannon's determination, her devotion to her children, her attempts to hold her marriage together. Bella's growing sensitivity, her small awareness of the world, her dependence on the adults around her. Celeste's energy, her simple trust, her innocence. The unborn child who represented an entire future that would never happen. Those lives were not symbols. They were real. They were complex and ordinary and filled with small moments that will never be documented in evidence because they were too normal to record. A child's hand reaching for comfort, a mother's tired smile, the quiet rhythms of family life that, when intact, feels so permanent that people stop noticing them. The case, at its deepest level, is a reminder that the most fragile thing in the world is the assumption of safety inside love. Love is not a guarantee. It is a relationship that must be sustained by choices, and when choices turn dark, love can become the very thing that makes someone vulnerable. In that sense, the Watts story is not only about one man's crimes. It is about the cost of deception, the way a double life corrodes the boundaries that protect others, the way resentment can grow in silence until it becomes something lethal. And the echo of it remains, not as a thriller, not as a mystery, but as a lingering moral weight. A shadow on the idea of home. A reminder that a quiet street in morning light can hold a tragedy so complete that even years later, people still feel the urge to slow down when they pass a similar house, as if the air itself might carry a warning they have not yet learned to hear.